Namaskar, everyone. Welcome back to our e-module on bridging knowledge gaps through climate change risk management. My name is Divya Rai, and I'm a research fellow at the Maritime Research Center, and I will be giving a presentation on the next topic. So far, we have completed our eight e-modules on various issues ranging from basics of climate change to climate change and multilateral organizations, net zero carbon emission, and the role of oceans. Today, in our presentation, we will sail through the impacts of freshwater resources and qualities. Let's begin the presentation. So the content of my presentation will be is divided in three sections, section A, B, and C. Section A will mainly be about the impacts of climate change on the freshwater resources. And the section B will talk about the recent trends, challenges, and mitigation strategy. While the section C will talk about the way forward and how should we mitigate the impacts of climate change on its freshwater ecosystem. To begin with, the section A. So, we all know that climate change has been impacting us in all forms, not just the environment, but is also impacting the oceans, the animals, the humans, the agriculture, the socioeconomic activities which are related with the climate change. So, in such scenarios, the climate change impacts are not limited to one particular issue. So, what should we do in that period? How should we go about? What are the main impacts of climate change on the freshwater ecosystem? So, to give an introduction about the topic, the climate change has definitely expected to exacerbate the current stress on the water resources. We see that our ocean spans about 70% of the world, but still, in most of the country, in most of part of the global world, we see that the countries are facing a lot of problems pertaining to the water crisis. And the climate change is further going to enhance those problems and those issues. So warming has also resulted in decline of mountain glaciers and snow covers in both. At the place where we talk about the rise in sea level, but we also need to acknowledge the fact that the melting of glaciers and the mountain ice caps are going to impact the ocean. Not just going to impact on the sea level rise, but is also going to impact the freshwater ecosystem. The rivers will dry up in case of no water coming from the mountains. And further, it will have an impact on the water resources or the water availability to the population. Then this in turn will lead to reducing water availability and hydropower potential. Once the rivers are not there, we have also seen that the water that comes from the mountains and the rivers have also various other purpose apart from the drinking and other activities, is also that they provide us other opportunities or more clean form of energy through hydropower potential. The change in seasonal flow of river in the region is something that we have been talking about, change the seasonal flow of the rivers in the region. So if the change in season is going to be there because of the climate change, then the rivers will be impacted. Some of them will be highly flooded and some of them will not be very highly flooded. Some of them will start drying up. There will be change in the course of the rivers. The rivers will also, the drainage, the parts will start drying up. And once the rivers, you'll see that there is a less flow in the river, that the agriculture also around those places will also get impacted. Now we'll touch upon how the impacts of climate change are there in various regions. First is the semi-arid region. The semi-arid region, basically the increase in aridity means because of the increased global warming, the heating up of the climate, there will be increase in more arid areas, which will enhance the warming and which affect the growing population. Then increase in land degradation and desertification. Because of the increased climate change, the land will start degrading because the less water availability, the less groundwater aquifers, and the chances of that area drying up will definitely increase. So once the annual potential evaporation exceeds the annual precipitation, it leads to the high long-term trends in aridity index. So the climate change is going to impact the desert areas which have less water availability, in terms of they will not be able to access the water. The groundwater will also deplete sooner or later. This will have an impact on the growing population living in that region. Next one is coastal hinterlands. The coastal areas are most vulnerable from the increase in sea rise, flooding, storm surges, and stronger winds. One place where we talk about that there will be melting of ice, melting of glaciers and snow. The rivers will start flooding. There will be more storm surges, and then also the leading in the higher impact will be the rise in sea level. Then flooding from the sea level, also the sea level, once they start rising, the warming of ocean is also going to increase the intensity of the cyclone and the time frame at which the cyclones are occurring at various regions. The flooding of the rising in sea level and the storm surges will threaten some of the islands which are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And the major deltas, you must have already read the news about the Sundarban being one of the most critical areas. It's one of the Ramsar sites, and it is very much at the front of the impacts of climate change, because if there is an increase in sea level rise, most of the areas of Sundarban is going to be underwater. So how do we deal in such scenarios and such case? It will have a severe impact on water supply and sanitation infrastructure. Is something that is going to impact the population living in those coastal areas. Next is the mountainous area. So the evidence that the high mountains are warming faster than the lower elevation. So the higher mountains have higher ice caps and ice caps on them. So if the warming is very high relatively, then the intensity and the frequency of melting of the water, melting of the ice cap is also going to be very high. Then, according to Mountain Research Initiative, over the past 20 years, the temperature above 4,000 meter have warmed nearly about 75% faster than the below 22,000 meter. The research shows that the valleys are warming relatively at a less rate compared to the high elevation areas. Then the impacts of melting glaciers will affect the resources or the population living downstream of those rivers. The rivers, once the melting is high, the population around those areas will be impacted in terms of their agriculture activities as well as the availability of water resources, because once the water will start coming, the floods will also increase, which will also lead to a lot of migration and devastation in that areas. Is the recent trends in water crisis due to the climate change. So the risk sensitive areas includes the semi-arid, coastal and hinterland and mountainous areas, as we have already read. So the SIDS will particularly affected by this trend. So if you look at the small island developing states, the small islands are some, we have been hearing a lot about that the small island are at very high risk of the climate change. How do we deal with it? How do we solve their problem? I think climate change is further going to exacerbate the issue of water resources, the sea level rise and everything. So, for example, the Tuvalu, the 1,500 of its population of 11,000 were left with no access to the freshwater resources. So, as you can already see, that a lot of data are mentioning that there will be a lot of impacts on the freshwater resources just because of the climate change.